Hello and welcome back to Social Distance Sing. Today's video is the last in this little mini series that I've been doing on the Tallis anthem If Ye Love Me. And basically we're going to be rounding off by working towards a sort of imaginary performance of the piece. So we're going to be going through everything that I would say to a choir in preparing to sing this piece in order to get a really consistent approach across all the individual members of the choir so that we get a really clear interpretation and a really polished performance of the piece. Some of this is going to be recapping some of what I've talked about in the last couple of videos on this piece, both in terms of the elements of reading and learning the notes of each individual part, and also the text and how we use the text to firstly sing it correctly with good technique, and also to introduce some elements of phrasing and shaping of the individual lines. Other bits of information will be new, or you might have picked up from the approach that I took in the learning tracks that I recorded for the first video in this series. So first of all, we're going to dive straight in, and I'm just going to go through in order the different elements that I want to talk about in this piece. I suggest if you're going to sing it, you might want to have a printed copy of the score that you can mark up. There's a link to where you can download that in the description. The music will be on screen as well, but you might want to mark in some of what I'm going to say on a copy so that you remember it when it does come to sing through the piece as a whole. So let's get stuck in. So first things first, the opening 4 bars. Now, I think this falls very naturally into two bar phrases, and I think we should breathe in the middle of those phrases, so after the word me. I think the tied note should come over the bar, and we should wait until the third bar has started before we breathe, so there isn't a huge amount of time. We don't need a huge amount of time because the following phrase isn't very long. But I think we do want the note to be sustained over the bar line and then breathe after that. I think in both phrases we want to swell slightly towards the middle of the phrase. If ye love me, keep my commandments, with the sort of natural inflection of text there. I think we can probably do it slightly more in the second phrase than the first phrase, just to keep the interest and the intensity building through these first 4 bars. We don't need to be too big in each of the 4 parts in terms of volume over these opening 4 bars, because we're all singing together, we're all singing at the same time. Once we get into the more contrapuntal stuff, you might need to bring out some of your entries a bit more so that we can hear them clearly through the texture. So when the soprano part kicks off, that sort of texture of writing in bar 5, we'll want to hear that very clearly over the chord that's fading away in the lower 3 parts. In both the following phrases of text, and I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another comforter. As I've illustrated there, we need to, again, swell through those first 3 notes. We touched on this last time in the diction video, thinking about how we can firstly build in dynamics over those first 3 repeated notes, but also use the consonants, bring the consonants in early to create that little gap before the vowel of the word pray, which just puts emphasis on it. And I will pray. Bringing the double L in fairly early there creates that little space, which then gets filled when we have the next word, and that creates a little accent. We can do the same with the f of father. Pray the Father. Just to point that word a little bit more as well. There's a lovely moment in bar 11 where on the second and third beats of that bar, the soprano, alto and tenor parts are first of all both singing the same syllables at the same time, and we haven't all been doing that for quite a while, but also they're moving from one F major triad to the next one up between those second and third beats. And actually this creates a really lovely kind of swelling motion as the bass part then kind of stays stable underneath it, but the upper 3 parts just swell upwards, and we want to bring that out as well. In the tenor part there, we've got lovely quaver movement that we can grow into with the minim in the second half of 11. Grow through the minim a little bit, and then when you get to the quavers at the start of bar 12, you'll be in a nice place to have that sort of cascading movement downwards through the next few notes. All four parts should phrase off towards the end of this first page through the second half of bar 12 into that cadence as we arrive at the start of bar 13. All four parts should then breathe as though they are carrying on immediately in the second half of bar 13. Only the tenor part actually is carrying on, but it's important there, I think, to create that just a clean break without worrying about different parts hanging on for different amounts of time. In each part, the phrase over that he may bide with you forever, I think is quite challenging because it's a long phrase, and often, if we're not careful, we can sort of peak too soon with it. We're tempted to grow through that high note after the jump up of a fourth or a fifth in the soprano part, but a fourth in the other three parts. That he may bide. The problem is if we do that, we kind of get to a natural climax in the phrase a couple of beats too early. It comes on bide, and I think it should come a bar later on the ever, on the first syllable of ever. So actually we need to hold something back over the beginning of that phrase. Don't let it grow too much, because we need to sustain that growth throughout the entirety of the phrase right up until the first syllable of ever. So it's that he may abide with you forever. So it really needs to come to a head there rather than any earlier, which means, as I say, that we do have to not too enthusiastically grow through that long high note in whichever part. Save something for the continuing phrase. It then needs to phrase off very quickly, of course, to back to its sort of original level on the second syllable of the word. And then at the end of this top line, again, suddenly we all come together, and that effect is sort of intensified because now all four parts are doing it at the same time. Phrase off very, very quickly, as I say, after the G major chord at the end of bar 18. It just kind of stops for a moment, which is really lovely. It's started to sort of unravel a little bit over the top line, and then we just pause on the G major chord before it resolves to the C major chord. Really, really lovely moment. And we can just feel the tension building through the top line of the second page. And it all comes to a head at once at the end of bar 18 and then suddenly resolves straight away. The tenor part obviously needs to breathe fairly quickly there. I think the soprano, alto and bass parts, this is in bar 19 now, should probably all breathe at the same time, again to create that just sort of cleanness without worrying about different parts breathing at different times. So all of those three parts, soprano, alto and bass, should breathe as though they're carrying on immediately, as the altos in fact do. Even the spirit of truth, as we discussed last time, spirit is one syllable, and I think it's the one that we want to aim for in this phrase. In the spirit of truth. Truth obviously is another important word within the phrase, but I think spirit is the main one there. And there's a few nice places where actually aiming for that creates a little bit of syncopation within the rhythm. The bass part at the end of bar 21, where the spirit comes on the upbeat to bar 22. On the bottom line, of course, the altos and the sopranos kind of swap places. The alto part goes above the soprano there, and we want to hear that pretty well as the melody. If you're singing the alto part, we can bring that out. Obviously, it's fairly high in the alto register, so you don't need to give it too much on the higher notes, but really just in the second half of that bottom line, make sure that the melody is continued in terms of intensity. In the spirit of truth at the end there, we still want to hear that very clearly. The sopranos shouldn't force their sound. They're coming very low in the soprano range there, and you shouldn't force the sound out. But we do want to hear, if possible, the C in the middle of the chord at the very end on the word truth. All the other parts are singing Fs, and we want to hear that C coming through the middle of the texture there. But as I say, don't force the sound if it's quite low in your register. People who have sung with me before know that one of my sort of pet grievances is the joining of consonants, of two consonants in a row into a single consonant sound that's completely different from either of them. I'm talking here about the word truth, which when sung should be truth, really. Not quite that slowly, of course, but it shouldn't, and this is the important point, it shouldn't turn into truth with a ch. There's no ch in the word truth. There's a slight one as we say it, but as I say, one of my things about good, clean consonants in choral singing is to make sure that we do separate them out. So, the spirit of truth, truth, there. It actually sounds reasonably natural. It sounds much better to me, anyway, than the spirit of truth. As we're sort of winding down at the end here, I think we can also separate the repetitions of those words. We get, particularly in the tenor and bass parts, the spirit of truth, the spirit of truth, just reiterated a couple of times along that bottom line, and I think we can treat each as its own individual phrase. This starts to just kind of naturally slow the rhythm down a little bit because we are feeling more breaks in the phrasing, we're feeling more accents on words like spirit and truth, and so it just sort of gradually gets more dense as we come towards the end, which is quite an effective way of making the music feel like it's slowing down and coming to a conclusion, even if we don't actually slow down. We will slow down marginally the second time, really I think only in the penultimate bar, bar 25, before jumping to the second time bar. I don't think it wants to slow up any at all before that. At the end of the first time bar, I think the soprano, alto and bass parts ought to breathe together, again creating that clean separation, and we don't have too many rogue consonants flying around. The tenor part obviously breathes earlier because they start off the repeat, but then the other three parts all breathe as though you're carrying on straight away at the start of bar 14 as we go back up to the top of the page, even though it's only the bass part that's actually doing that. And on the subject of the repeat, the final thing that I want to draw out here is obviously lots of music from this period has a repeated section, often a repeated final section. I always like to do something a little bit different between the two. I tend not to want to just have it the same both times round. I think we don't need to do too much with this, as I've kind of explored over the last few minutes. There's lots of areas for light and shade, and phrasing with the contours of the melody and the natural inflection of the text and so on. Primarily, we're doing that through dynamic phrasing, growing through phrases until we get to the important syllable and then resolving the tension off at the end of the phrase. And I think the way to treat the second time, the repeat of this final page, is basically just to do that more, to make the shapes bigger. The phrases can start more gently, grow more than they did the first time, and then come back to the much more gentle touch at the end as well, which also has the natural effect of making the end, the very end of the piece, very relaxed, and it's just all come to a nice, gentle conclusion, which works really well in this piece, I think. And as we come towards the end for the second time, there's a really nice little moment in the alto part at the end of bar 24, where it just lengthens that first syllable of the phrase, the iun. And particularly the second time, as we come towards the very end of the piece, I think that we can see that as just redistributing the emphasis of the text in that phrase. We've up to now been having even the spirit of truth, but here, after that, we do have that phrase from bar 23, in the spirit of truth, in the spirit. It just places the emphasis there on the front of the phrase as we come towards the conclusion of the piece. So in just a moment we're going to come to the final performance, as it were, of this piece of Tallis. Before you sing, obviously, if you want to sing along, I encourage you to warm up the voice. If you've been following for a few weeks, you'll know that I've introduced a variety of exercises in order to help you do that. So go back and have a look at those if you need a reminder, and then when you're ready, you can come back here to sing through, again, this just gorgeous piece of Tallis. It's one that I often feel like I forget how good it is because you hear it so often and you sing it quite often as well, probably, if you sing in a church or any other choir. But over the last weeks, really sort of getting into the details of it for me have reminded me how well put together it is, how beautifully the music and the text match each other, and that just creates all of these lovely shapes and arcs that point to different words in the text, emphasize different things, and the melodies and the harmonies just fit together beautifully with that. So please do join in if you would like to. I've re-recorded, in fact, the voice parts from the learning tracks that I did for the very first video in this series. That was done in a bit of a hurry just because of where I was at that week, and I wasn't particularly happy with them at the time. But as I say, I re-recorded them again to hopefully bring out a little bit more of some of the things that I've been talking about in this video, and hopefully just to sing them a bit better. It's a really interesting time at the moment to work on really detailed aspects of vocal technique, because I think singing in a choir, the overall sound of the choir can often cover up a few things in individuals, and I'm particularly aware of this myself. When I sing with people, there are certain aspects of my own technique that I think get sort of hidden in the mix of the sound, which is probably a good thing. But for the time being, of course, we are kind of all being soloists, just singing on our own at home. So it really kind of shows through some of the things that we need to work on, and I've been very aware of that in preparing these videos. I hope you've also found them helpful and enjoyable. Of course, that's the main thing. I certainly have enjoyed making them and really enjoying getting to grips, as I say, with this piece of Tallis. So let's have the final sing through of what we've been working on for the last few weeks. The gorgeous, really well-known, really deservedly well-known anthem by Thomas Tallis, If Ye Love Me.
If ye love me, keep my commandments, and I will pray the Father, and I will pray the Father, and he shall give
Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed these videos. I will be back next week with something. I'm not quite sure what yet, whether I'm going to start another anthem or go back to doing hymn singing for a time, or psalm singing maybe. If you have any preferences, any ideas, suggestions, or anything, do let me know in comments. And in any case, as I say, I'll be back next week with something. Until then, I hope you have a really great week, and I hope to see you again next time.